Thank you. My name is Samuel Bell, and I'm the state coordinator for the Rhode Island Progressive Democrats. My first experience with the voter ID law came when I was collecting signatures for Representative Chris Blazczewski. I met a woman who was very, very supportive, but she told me, "I don't think I can sign this. I don't have ID." I had to tell her that all of her rights were not taken away. She could sign the nomination papers. She told me that she had stopped driving, as she put it, as a public service. And I did not know at the time that I could tell her a variety of alternate means she could use to vote in 2012. My second experience with this law came when I was working as a poll checker for a primary campaign on the west side of Providence. Of the 50 or 60 people who came to vote that morning, I would say about 5 or 6 people had some sort of issue with identification. I remember a white man who came without a license and was incensed that he was asked for ID, informing the poll checkers at some length how he had fought for his country, and he had not fought for his country only to have his rights taken away back home, and he was very angry. Eventually, the poll checkers convinced him to vote with a veteran's ID. But he was the only person with an ID the poll checkers got to vote. Most of the voters who lacked ID said they would return with ID in hand. Now, I was only there for the morning until about noon, but I never saw any of them return. They were not informed of their right to vote by provisional ballot. Eventually, I got fed up and told one of the voters who got turned away that he could vote by provisional ballot, and ultimately he did get to vote. But most of them left without voting. My final experience with this law came on Election Day in November. While canvassing Pawtucket for David Cicilline, I met a voter who once again told me he did not think he could vote because he did not have identification. Like most people disenfranchised by this law, he was a strong Democrat, telling me how much he wanted to vote for Obama and all the other Democrats on the ballot, but he had no license. And we went through the various sorts of ID he had, and I told him I thought, but I was not sure, that he could probably vote with a hospital bill. Of all the people I've met who were disenfranchised by this law, only one actually submitted a provisional ballot. And the way this law plays out on the ground, the real damage comes not from the people reported by the statistics. It is the people who do not even show up. It is the people who do show up but go back for their ID and never return. And that's why the Rhode Island Progressive Democrats strongly support Senator Golden's bill and urge the General Assembly to repeal voter ID. Now, I'd just like to briefly address Senator Metz's bill. And the concern we have with this bill comes from 3 specific words that are struck from the original law, and that is including without limitation. This is a critical provision in the original law because it allows the Board of Elections to identify IDs that are not specifically enumerated in the law. What Senator Metz's bill does is includes a few of the IDs that the Board of Elections had identified as additional IDs, but not all of them. And we would encourage the bill to spell out all of those additional IDs. But it's also important that the including without limitation provision remain, because this bill, if this law is still in place, say in 50 years, it is likely that the composition of identification that the average voter will carry will have changed significantly. There may be different sorts of identification that most people carry. And it is important that the Board of Elections have the power to add additional forms of identification as they become common. So our objection to this bill comes from striking the words including without limitation. I'd just like to clarify that.
Senator Lombardi.
Thank you. Mr. Bell, I read along with your written testimony as you testified. One thing that you eliminated, in your written testimony, you talk about voter intimidation tactics and repealing the voter ID. How are those two, voter ID and voter intimidation tactics, how do you equate those two?
How do I equate those? So I think if you look at how these laws have been implemented nationally, I would make the case that in many states, the purpose of the law is to discourage certain classes of voters from voting. And I consider that